The rain fell in cold, merciless sheets across the Caldwell, Kansas train station platform, and Orville Lockhart had not moved in 47 minutes. He stood exactly where he had planted himself when the first drops began, his broad shoulders squared against the downpour, his dark hat pulled low and soaked clean through, his boots sunk into a thin river of mud that crept across the warped wooden planks of the platform. In his hands, held out at chest height with the kind of quiet, stubborn dignity that defined every single thing he did, was a square of white pine board. On it, in careful black letters he had painted himself by lamplight the night before, were two words, Etta Abbott. The train from St. Louis had arrived 22 minutes ago. Every other passenger had long since claimed their bags, greeted their people, and moved on into the gray Kansas afternoon. Every porter had stopped looking at him. The station master had come out twice, once to offer an umbrella which Orville declined, and once to suggest the woman might have missed her connection in Kansas City, which Orville also declined to believe. He had written to her for 11 months. He had read every one of her letters so many times, the paper had gone soft at the folds. He knew the way she described the smell of magnolias outside the window of the boarding house in Memphis, where she had lived for 3 years after leaving her family's tobacco farm. He knew she was afraid of nothing except being forgotten. He knew she took her coffee without sugar, and that she had taught herself to read Latin from a priest's discarded grammar books, for no other reason than that she refused to believe there were things in this world not available to her mind. He had not expected her to be beautiful. He had not let himself want that. What he had wanted was someone real, someone who meant what she wrote, and from the first letter she sent in reply to his carefully worded advertisement in the Memphis Daily Appeal, he had been certain she was exactly that. And now the platform was empty except for him and his sign, and the rain that drummed against the tin roof of the station, in a sound like the whole world calling him a fool. He did not lower the sign, not because he was too proud to accept what was becoming obvious, not because he lacked the intelligence to read the situation. Orville Lockhart was a man who had built a cattle ranch from 40 acres of raw Kansas grassland with his own 2 hands over 12 years, who had survived a drought that killed half his herd and 2 hard winters that killed the other ranchers' spirits, and he had done it all by being honest with himself about what was real and what was wishful thinking. He kept holding the sign because somewhere in the core of him, where all the hardest truths lived, he believed she was coming. He believed it the way he believed in water finding its level and seed following warmth. Not hope, something older and quieter than hope. Which is why, when the second train pulled into Caldwell Station at 3:06 in the afternoon, the one that had left Kansas City 4 hours behind schedule because of a collapsed cattle crossing on the line south of Emporia, Orville Lockhart was still there, and Etta Abbott stepped off it into the rain. She was not what he had imagined. She was more than that, and less, and entirely different and completely right, all at once and in the same moment. And Orville Lockhart, who had not been thrown by anything in over a decade, felt the breath leave his body in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She was 28 years old, of medium height, with dark hair plastered to her forehead by the rain before she had taken 3 steps off the train, wearing a gray wool traveling dress that had seen better journeys, carrying a single leather bag that was obviously too heavy for one hand, but she was carrying it with one hand anyway, and she was scanning the platform with dark brown eyes that were sharp and searching, and completely without the fear that Orville had privately worried he might see in them. She saw the sign before she saw the man holding it. He watched her eyes find the letters of her own name, watched something flicker across her face that was not quite relief and not quite surprise and not quite anything he had a word for, and then she looked up past the sign to the man behind it. They looked at each other through the rain for 3 full seconds. "You waited," she said. It was not a question. It came out low and a little rough, the way a voice sounds when it has been holding something carefully for a long time. "The second train was late," Orville said. It seemed premature to leave. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile. the suggestion of one like the first warmth in a March morning before the frost has fully decided to give up. "You are soaking wet," she said. "I am," he agreed. "How long have you been standing here?" "A while." She shifted the bag to her other hand. Her fingers had gone white around the handle. "Did it occur to you that I might not come?" "It occurred to me," he said carefully. "I decided to wait anyway." She looked at him for another long moment. This man she had written to for nearly a year without knowing his face. This man who had told her in plain and unadorned language that he had a working cattle ranch outside Caldwell, that he was 34 years old, that he had been alone for 4 years since his wife died of scarlet fever, that he was not looking for a replacement for anyone, but was looking for a partner in the fullest sense of the word, that he believed marriage was a serious business, and he did not intend to approach it any other way, and that if she had similar beliefs she might consider whether Kansas was something she could accept. She had written back. And then he had written back. And 11 months of letters had passed between them carrying everything real they knew how to say. Now here they were in the rain, strangers who were not quite strangers, and Etta Abbott made her decision the way she made all her decisions, which was quickly and without visible hesitation, even when the hesitation was enormous on the inside. She walked toward him across the wet platform and stopped 3 feet away, and she put out her free hand. He looked at it. Then he shifted the sign under his arm, freeing his right hand, and he took hers. His hand was large and very warm, even soaked through with cold rain, and hers was smaller and currently frozen. And when they shook hands it was formal and serious, and also the most significant thing either of them had done in years. "Etta Abbott," she said. "Orville Lockhart," he said. "I know," she told him. And then, because she was who she was, she added, "You should have brought an umbrella." "Probably," he said. And something in his voice, some quiet thread of wry warmth that lived beneath all that steadiness, made her look at him more carefully, and what she saw there made the frozen thing in her chest shift just slightly, like a door that has been shut too long against winter beginning, by the smallest degree, to ease. This is the story of how that door opened all the way. It had begun, in truth, with a letter that almost was not written. Etta Abbott, in the spring of 1882, was living in a boarding house on Beale Street in Memphis, Tennessee, employed as a schoolteacher at a small private school that served the children of merchants and tradespeople, and she was, by any outward measure, managing her life with considerable competence and considerable loneliness in roughly equal measure. She had come to Memphis from her family's tobacco farm in western Tennessee 3 years before, following a situation she did not discuss and rarely permitted herself to think about directly, involving a man named Gerald Prentice who had told her he loved her for 2 years, and then married a cotton merchant's daughter in a ceremony to which Etta was not invited, and of which she learned only because the preacher's wife thought she deserved to know. The betrayal had been complete, and it had been public, and it had restructured something fundamental in Etta Abbott's approach to the world. She had become more careful, more private, more watchful of the distance between what people said and what they meant, between promises and intentions, between the story a person told about themselves and the story that was actually true. She was not bitter. She had examined bitterness carefully and decided it was not something she could afford. But she was cautious, in the way of someone who has learned the cost of being otherwise. The advertisement in the Memphis Daily Appeal had caught her eye on a Tuesday morning in late April when she was grading arithmetic papers at the kitchen table of the boarding house, and the landlady, Mrs. Dupree, had left the newspaper open on the counter. Most of the matrimonial advertisements she had seen over the years followed a predictable structure of vague compliments and vaguer promises. This one did not. It read, in full, "Kansas cattle rancher, 34, widower, seeks a correspondent with intent toward marriage. I am not a man given to flattery or exaggeration, so I will offer only facts. I have 640 acres under fence south of Caldwell in Sumner County, a herd of approximately 180 head, a 4-room house built of limestone that does not leak, and a genuine need for the kind of partnership that requires two capable people. I am serious in my intentions, and I expect the same. If you are unafraid of hard work and honest enough to say what you mean, I would welcome a letter. Write to O. Lockhart, Box 14, Caldwell, Kansas. She had read it 3 times. Then she had set down her red pencil and looked out the window for a while. What caught her was not any single thing but the cumulative honesty of it. The limestone house that does not leak. The approximate herd count. The word genuine applied not to feeling but to need. It was the advertisement of someone who had thought carefully about what he actually had to offer, and then offered only that, without decoration. It was also, she noticed, the advertisement of someone who used precise language. That mattered to her more than she would have been able to fully explain. She wrote back that evening on her best paper in her clearest hand, and she introduced herself with the same economy he had used. She was 27. A school teacher, experienced with hard work, Memphis-born but not Memphis-rooted, and she had no intention of misrepresenting herself in any particular, so she would state plainly that she had been deceived by someone she trusted, and that had made her careful. And if he found that off-putting, he should say so directly, and she would thank him for his candor. His response arrived in 12 days, which given the postal route was nearly as fast as it could travel. And it said that he did not find it off-putting at all, that in fact he had been worried she would find his advertisement too blunt, and was relieved to discover she preferred bluntness, that he was sorry someone had treated her dishonestly, because it was his experience that most people deserved better than that, and that he had a question if she did not mind. What did she consider the most important quality in a partner? She wrote back, honesty, which I mean not merely as the absence of lying but as the commitment to being truthful even when it is costly. He wrote back, I agree. And then he told her something about himself that she had not expected, which was that he had loved his first wife, Clara, deeply, and had mourned her for a long time, and that he was writing to Etta not because he had forgotten Clara or considered her replaceable, but because being alone on a working ranch for 4 years had taught him something about the difference between solitude and loneliness, and he was very tired of being lonely. That letter changed things. Etta had read it sitting up in her narrow bed at the boarding house at 10 o'clock on a winter night with snow on the window, and the house quiet around her, and something in her chest had ached in the way that something aches when it recognizes itself unexpectedly in something else. She wrote back about loneliness, not her Gerald Prentice loneliness, which was the loneliness of betrayal, but the older, deeper loneliness of being intelligent and particular in a world that consistently underestimated her. She wrote about what it was like to teach arithmetic to children whose fathers assumed she was merely keeping the children occupied until a real teacher could be found, who had never once considered that she might actually understand mathematics. She wrote about reading Latin in her room and the complicated feeling of being proud of something that no one around her would have valued. His response to that letter was the one she kept rereading in the months that followed. It was 4 pages long, which was longer than he had ever written, and in it, he talked about what it meant to him to understand land in a way that other men who had grown up in cities couldn't quite grasp, to know a piece of ground so well you could predict where it would hold water and where it would dry out first, to build something lasting from what looked like nothing. He said he thought the loneliness of being competent in ways other people don't see was one of the quietest and most persistent forms of suffering he knew. He said he did not think she should have to be lonely. After that letter, Etta Abbott had begun, very quietly and very privately, to hope. The wagon ride from Caldwell Station to the Lockhart Ranch took just over an hour in normal conditions, and closer to an hour and 40 minutes in the mud and rain of that particular afternoon, and it was during this ride that Orville Lockhart and Etta Abbott conducted the most significant first conversation of their lives. It was not easy. There was the rain on the canvas cover over the wagon bed which she sat under while he drove, which required him to half turn on the seat to speak to her. There was the strangeness of physical proximity, after 11 months of paper and ink. There was the accumulated weight of everything they had said to each other against the fact that they were still, essentially, strangers in the flesh. But Orville Lockhart had not built a cattle ranch by avoiding the difficult thing, and Etta Abbott had not built a life in Memphis by pretending that uncomfortable situations would resolve themselves without effort. "How was the journey?" he asked first. "Long," she said. "There was a delay in Kansas City. Something with the tracks." "A collapsed crossing south of Emporia," he said. "I heard about it at the station. Is that common? Crossings collapse when cattle push on them in numbers." "The railroads don't always build them with the weight in mind." He paused. "Were you comfortable on the train?" "Reasonably. The woman in my compartment had a child who was unwell and there was not much sleep, but we managed." She watched a hawk drift low across the soaked prairie and disappear into the gray. "It is very flat," she said. "It is," he agreed. He said it without apology but also without defensiveness, the way a man states a fact about something he genuinely loves and does not feel he needs to justify. She noticed that. "You don't mind that I said it?" "Why would I? It is flat. There's no arguing with the land." He glanced back at her briefly. "Does it bother you?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I've never been somewhere without trees. The flatness is startling, but startling isn't necessarily bad." "No," he said, "it isn't." They were quiet for a moment. The horse moved steadily through the mud, unbothered. Orville handled the reins with the practiced ease of someone for whom this was as natural as breathing. "I want to ask you something," Etta said, "and I want you to understand that I am asking it directly because I believe direct questions deserve direct answers, not because I mean to be rude." "Go ahead," he said. "Were you worried I wouldn't come?" He considered this with the same care he gave everything. "I was aware it was possible," he said. "People change their minds. Circumstances change. A year of letters is not the same as a year of acquaintance. I knew that. But you waited in the rain for 2 hours." "I waited until it was clear one way or the other," he said. "Standing in the rain seemed preferable to not knowing." "You could have waited inside the station." "I could have," he agreed. She understood suddenly that the waiting in the rain was not stubbornness or absent-mindedness. It was a statement, made with his whole body, to no one in particular and to her specifically, about the quality of his intentions. He had wanted to be seen waiting, not because he wanted credit for it, but because he thought it was the kind of thing that ought to be visible. "In one of your letters," she said slowly, "you wrote that you believe integrity is not about the large decisions but about the small, consistent ones. Do you remember that?" "I remember," he said. "The sign," she said. "In the rain. That was a small, consistent decision." He turned to look at her more fully then, the horse managing itself for a moment on the familiar road. Something moved in his expression that she could not quite read yet, because she did not yet know his face well enough to have a key to it. But she thought it was something like being seen, really seen, in the specific way that he had apparently been able to see her through letters for 11 months but had not expected to receive in return quite so quickly. "It was," he said quietly. "The ranch appeared through the rain in the early evening, and it was not what Etta had imagined, and it was better. The advertisement had said Limestone House, and she had pictured something small and rough. But the house that emerged from the gray dusk was a solid, well-proportioned building of pale golden stone, with a covered front porch running the full width, 4 windows across the front, a chimney at each end, and the kind of settled, permanent look that said it had been built by someone who intended to stay. There was a barn beyond the house, large and practical, and beyond that the beginning of the fenced pasture where she could make out the shapes of cattle moving in the wet distance. Smoke came from the left chimney. Light showed in 2 front windows. It looked, she thought with an unexpected lurch of something she had no name for yet, like somewhere that had been waiting to be arrived at. A woman came out onto the porch as Orville brought the wagon to a stop, a sturdy Mexican woman of about 50 with dark braided hair and a shawl around her shoulders, and an expression of calm appraisal that missed nothing. "This is Consuela Vargas," Orville said, climbing down and coming around to help Etta with her bag. She has worked here for 8 years and knows where everything is and is generally right about most things. Most things, Consuela said from the porch. Most things, Orville repeated, without any change in inflection. Welcome, Miss Abbott, Consuela said. There is soup and there is hot water for washing, and you look like you need both equally. I am very glad to be here, Etta said, and was surprised to find she meant it. Inside, the house was warm and plainly furnished, which was to say the furniture was good and carefully chosen, and none of it was decorative in the way of fashion, but all of it was functional in the way of sense. A stone fireplace dominated the front room. The kitchen at the back was larger than most in her experience, with a proper iron cookstove and shelves of organized provisions, and a long oak table that looked as though it had been built for conversation as much as for meals. Her room, which Consuela showed her upstairs, was the front corner room with a window that looked east over the prairie, a proper iron bedstead with a good quilt, a washstand, and a small writing desk with a lamp. She stood in the middle of the room with her wet coat dripping on the floor and looked at the writing desk, and something in her chest completed a motion that had begun on the train platform in the rain. He had put a writing desk in the room he prepared for her, not a dressing table, not an extra chair, a writing desk, because he had been paying attention. She sat down to supper that first night with Orville and Consuela, and supper was chicken soup with cornbread and strong coffee, and it was the best meal she had eaten in months. Orville ate with the appetite of a man who had been outdoors in cold rain for most of the day, which was considerable. Consuela ate and watched with her calm, calibrated attention. Etta asked about the ranch. She asked specific questions, because she was specific by nature. How many acres were under cultivation versus pasture? What breed of cattle he ran? What his arrangement was with the beef buyers out of Wichita? Whether he was fenced against the cattle drives that still sometimes cut through the county heading north. Orville answered every question directly and in detail, and by the third question something had changed in the set of his shoulders, a kind of release, the way a person's body relaxes when they discover they do not need to translate themselves. He was used to being the only person at his table who understood the ranch in depth, and the absence of that particular solitude was immediate and physical. "You've read about the cattle business," he said. "I read everything," she told him. "When I knew I was coming to a cattle ranch in Kansas, I read everything I could find. I borrowed 4 books from the Memphis library and read the relevant sections of the Agricultural Almanac." Consuela made a small sound that might have been approval. "What did you find most interesting?" Orville asked, and it was a genuine question, not a test. "The water politics," she said immediately. "The conflict over creek rights and the way the big operations were beginning to monopolize water access. I think that's going to become a serious problem in the next decade." Orville put down his coffee cup. He looked at her across the table with an expression of such transparent, undefended surprise that she almost laughed. "I've been saying that for 2 years," he said. "My neighbor Hatch thinks I'm worried over nothing." "Your neighbor Hatch is wrong," she said, and that was the beginning of everything. They were not married immediately. This was 1882, and they were both people of some deliberateness. And while the legal and social arrangement of their situation required formalization, both Orville and Etta had agreed in the final letters before her departure that they would allow themselves a period of genuine acquaintance before making that commitment irrevocable, because they were both the kind of people who believed in doing things properly. What this meant in practice was that Etta stayed at the ranch as Orville's invited guest, with Consuela providing the appropriate chaperone presence that the community of Caldwell would require, and they spent the first 2 weeks learning each other in the actual flesh. It was different from the letters. Everything was different. In letters, you chose what to reveal and when. You composed yourself before you wrote. You had time to think about the shape of what you were communicating. In person, there was no such control. He saw her at breakfast before she was quite awake, unguarded and slower than usual, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup and staring out the east window in silence until the first cup was finished. She saw him when he came in from evening rounds in February cold, red-cheeked and direct and speaking in the clipped, efficient language of someone who had spent all day alone and found socializing briefly exhausting before finding it, in her company specifically, refreshing. She learned that he was a man of absolute routine, not from rigidity, but from the deep understanding that a ranch operated on rhythm and that breaking rhythm had costs. She learned that he laughed rarely but genuinely, a low, quiet sound that was more intimate for being unusual. She learned that he read widely when he had the time, that his small library of well-worn books included a Shakespeare, 2 volumes of natural history, a copy of Tocqueville that had been read many times, and 3 novels that he had not admitted to in any letter and which she discovered on the bottom shelf one rainy afternoon, and which told her something about him that all the letters combined had not. He was reading a novel. She held it up. He looked at it, then at her. "It seemed impolite to mention in correspondence," he said, "that you read novels." "That I read that particular novel," he said. "It was a battered copy of Jane Eyre." A man in the cattle business is expected to have certain opinions about what constitutes suitable reading. Etta Abbott sat down on the floor of the front room with the book in her hands and looked up at him with an expression that he would later tell her was the moment he understood beyond any doubt that he was in serious trouble where she was concerned. "You read Jane Eyre," she said. "Several times," he admitted. "Orville Lockhart," she said. "I have been very careful not to form expectations that outrun reality. But I want you to understand that this information is making that extremely difficult." The first time she called him by his full name like that, both names together, it hit him somewhere low in his chest with the specific force of something becoming real. "I'll try to be more measured in future," he said, very seriously. "Don't you dare," she said. There was a moment then. A charged, still moment in the firelit front room with the winter rain against the windows, and the book between them and everything that had been building for 11 months pressing against the surface of the current moment looking for a way through. He looked at her on the floor with his book, and she looked up at him from the floor with his book, and neither of them moved, and neither of them spoke, and it was the most eloquent conversation they had yet had. She was the first to look away, because she was not ready yet. Her caution was real even if the feeling was real also, and she had learned the cost of moving faster than trust could carry her. He accepted her looking away with the same quiet steadiness with which he accepted everything, and he went to put more wood on the fire, and the moment passed into something that would live between them permanently even after it was over. The town of Caldwell received Etta Abbott with the mixture of curiosity and wariness that a small Kansas cattle town in 1882 reserved for women who arrived alone and obviously educated. She met the wives of the other ranchers and the merchants in her first week, and she was assessed with the thoroughness that a new woman in a small community always receives. She handled it with the composure she had developed in Memphis, which was the composure of someone who had learned that the most effective response to scrutiny was calm competence rather than either aggression or performance. She asked sensible questions about the town, complimented what deserved complimenting, and offered nothing personal that had not been asked for. The woman she liked immediately was Margaret Chen, who ran the dry goods store with her husband Thomas, a taciturn man of considerable industry, and who had arrived in Caldwell herself only 4 years earlier under circumstances she described with cheerful bluntness as complicated. Margaret was 32 and had the matter-of-fact warmth of someone for whom life had been various and who had decided to find it interesting rather than alarming. "He's a good man," Margaret said to Etta one afternoon the first week, while Etta was selecting thread at the dry goods counter. "Lockhart, I know you know that already from the letters, but I thought you should hear it said plainly by someone who has known him here. He is a genuinely good man. Honest, fair, doesn't drink to excess, doesn't talk unkindly about people behind their backs. After Clara died, he grieved properly, without making anyone else carry it for him. We have men in this town who are far less than that. Etta listened to this with care. What was she like, Clara? Margaret paused, choosing her words. Gentle, very gentle, loved the garden. Not much for the cattle side of things, but she made the house into something beautiful, and she was kind to everyone. She looked at Etta directly. She was nothing like you. I say that as pure observation, not criticism. I know, Etta said. He needs what you are, Margaret said. The gentle and beautiful was always going to be too fragile out here, I think, though I would never have said so when she was alive. He needs someone as solid as he is, someone who isn't afraid of the land. Etta thought about this for several days. She thought about it especially one morning in early March when Orville took her out on horseback to show her the full extent of the ranch, a thing she had asked for, and he had arranged without comment, saddling a gentle bay mare named Rosie for her use, and leading her out across the still cold grassland in pale early light. The Lockhart Ranch in all its extent was something she could not have understood from inside the house or even from the road. It was vast in the way that only opened land is vast, not empty but full of wind and grass, and the smell of frozen earth beginning to soften, and the enormous silence that was not silence at all, but rather a different kind of sound. The sky over it was the biggest she had ever seen in her life, bigger than she had imagined the sky could actually be, a pale blue arch that began at her feet and continued indefinitely in every direction. Orville rode beside her and watched her seeing it for the first time. She did not say anything for a long while. She just rode and looked, and the mare moved easily under her, and the ranch spread itself out around them in its morning self. "It's alive," she finally said. "Yes," he said. "I mean, I knew that intellectually, but seeing it is different." She gestured with one hand in a way that encompassed the grass moving in the wind, the distant cattle, the creak of a windmill near the pond. "It has a pulse." "It does," he said. "Do you ever get lonely out here? Not the personal kind, the other kind, the scale of it." He thought about this. "When I first came here, yes. The scale felt like an indictment of something, like it was pointing out how small a man is." He paused. "But after a time it changed. I stopped measuring myself against it and started just being in it, and then it stopped being lonely." She turned to look at him in the morning light. His profile against that enormous sky was quiet and composed, and she thought suddenly, here is a person who knows where he stands, not only in terms of geography, though there was that too, but in the larger sense. He knew what he was doing, why it mattered. He had arrived at himself without any theater about it. The frozen thing in her chest, which had been easing by slow degrees since the train platform, moved significantly. She did not yet call it what it was. She was Etta Abbott, and she had been wrong before, and she was not in the habit of naming things before she was certain of them. But she acknowledged it to herself as she rode back toward the limestone house in the strengthening morning, this significant motion in her chest, and she did not try to argue it back to where it had been. It was near the end of March when the trouble arrived, and it arrived with his name announced before the knock at the door. Consuela came to find Etta in the kitchen where she was working on a new correspondence, 3 names having been volunteered by Margaret Chen from women in Wichita who might like to correspond with the rancher's new wife arrangement, which Etta had undertaken to help facilitate because she thought it was important work, and because doing useful things was how she managed anxiety. "There is a man from the land office in Wichita," Consuela said, and her voice had a particular quality of careful neutrality that Etta had learned to read as meaning Consuela considered the situation potentially serious. "A Mr. Hargrove. He is asking for Orville." Orville was in the barn and had not yet come in. Etta went to the door. The man on the porch was perhaps 45, well-dressed for rural Kansas in a way that read as someone more comfortable in an office than on land, with a flat folder under his arm and the expression of someone who had brought paperwork that was going to cause someone else a significant problem. "Miss Abbott," he looked surprised. "I am Miss Abbott," she said. "Orville Lockhart is just coming in from the barn. Can I help you?" Hargrove hesitated, then apparently decided a woman who answered the door of a ranch house with that much composure was not someone he was going to patronize successfully. "I have a matter concerning the survey of Lockhart's eastern boundary," he said. "There has been a competing claim filed on approximately 80 acres along the eastern fence line." "A competing claim," she repeated. "Filed by whom?" "A Mr. Albert Crane of Wichita," he said. "He is claiming a prior homestead survey that predates Lockhart's fence by 2 years." Orville came in from the barn at that moment, and Etta stepped back so he could come onto the porch, and she watched his face as Hargrove repeated what he had told her. The set of Orville's expression did not change in any way that would be visible to someone who did not know him. But she knew him now, and what she saw was a deep, controlled anger, which was different from hot anger in the way that a river in flood is different from a bonfire, more powerful and more lasting. "Albert Crane has never homesteaded anything in Sumner County," Orville said. "I know every claim filed in this county for the last 15 years. "Nevertheless," Hargrove said, and opened his folder. That evening, after Hargrove had left and supper had been eaten largely in silence broken only by Consuela's strategic deployment of additional cornbread as an act of comfort, Etta sat across the kitchen table from Orville, with the copies of Hargrove's documents between them. She had read everything Hargrove left twice. Orville had read it once, which was his usual practice. He had been quiet since Hargrove left in a way that was different from his usual quiet, tighter, charged. "This survey," she said, pointing to the document on top. "The date here, March 1879. "That's 2 years before I fenced that line," he said. "Yes, but look at the surveyor's signature." She slid it toward him. "Theodore Marsh. Do you know a Theodore Marsh?" "He did work in this county in the late 70s, Orville said slowly. "He left in 1880. There was some question about the accuracy of his work on the Hendricks property." "What kind of question?" "Numbers that didn't quite match the land." Etta looked at him steadily. "This document might be fraudulent," she said, "or it might be a genuine survey that was dishonestly filed by Crane after the fact, which is also fraud." He looked at her. "You're thinking about the legal angle." "I'm thinking that you need to get to Wichita before this becomes a formal proceeding, and you need to bring every original survey document you have for that eastern boundary, and you need to find someone who knew Theodore Marsh and can speak to the reliability of his work." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the papers. "You didn't have to involve yourself in this," he said. "I know that," she said. "I mean it, this isn't your problem yet. Legally it isn't your property." She met his eyes directly. "Orville, you built this ranch. You built it correctly, with legitimate filings and honest work. Someone is trying to take 80 acres of it through fraud. Do you genuinely believe there is any version of this situation in which I sit upstairs reading my Latin grammar while you deal with it alone?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, something that had been careful and self-sufficient and slightly braced against the possibility of leaning on anyone, because you built what you built alone and you defended it alone, and that was what being a man on the frontier meant, and all of that shifted. "No," he said quietly. "I don't believe that." "Good," she said. "Now tell me everything you know about Albert Crane." Albert Crane, it turned out, was a land speculator out of Wichita who had been systematically filing questionable claims on boundary parcels of established ranches for the past 18 months, always through a third party, always using surveys by Theodore Marsh, who was conveniently no longer in the state. 3 other ranchers in Sumner County had faced similar claims, and none of them had successfully challenged Crane, because none of them had known how to navigate the legal labyrinth of the Kansas Land Office. Etta learned this from Margaret Chen, who learned it from Thomas, who heard it from a buyer at the stockyard in Wichita who had 2 rancher clients in the same situation. She laid this information before Orville the next morning with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had spent the night thinking rather than sleeping. She also laid before him the name of a lawyer in Wichita, A man named Ezra Pullman who had argued 2 land fraud cases before the federal circuit and won both. Orville looked at the name. Where did you get this? Thomas Chen went to school in Ohio with a man who is now a clerk in the federal courthouse in Wichita, she said. I asked Margaret to ask Thomas this morning. He was quiet for a moment in a way she had begun to recognize as him processing something that had moved him. You did all of this last night, he said. I didn't sleep, she said. I was thinking. Etta, just her name said in a particular way. Don't, she said quickly, and her voice was a little unsteady. Don't say whatever you are about to say right now. Let us solve this first and then you can say it. He looked at her. She was looking at the papers. Her jaw was set in the stubborn line he was beginning to know as well as his own hands, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that he recognized because he had felt it in himself. The fierce, private effort of someone who cared about something and was not yet ready to admit how much. All right, he said. They rode to Wichita together 4 days later in the ranch wagon, Consuela having been scandalized and then pragmatic, providing them with a covered basket of provisions and her blessing in that order. The journey took a full day on the dry spring roads, and they talked for most of it in the easy, ranging way that had characterized their letter correspondence but had a different quality now, warmer and more immediate, because the physical presence of the other person changed everything about conversation. He told her about building the house. He told her about the first winter when the wind came through what he had thought were solid walls, and he had spent 2 weeks in December banking the foundation with sod and hanging buffalo hides over the windows, and how in the morning the hides would be stiff with frost, and he would pull them down and see the sun on the prairie and think, I will learn this place or it will beat me, and either way I will understand something true. She told him about the night she found out about Gerald Prentice. Not the surface facts, which she had mentioned briefly in a letter, but the actual night, sitting in her room at her family's farmhouse with the preacher's wife's letter in her hands, looking at the wall, and going through a process that she could only describe as dismantling and reassembling her own understanding of reality. She had believed something. The thing she had believed was false. She had to find out what was true instead. She had done that, methodically and without drama, and by morning she had a plan and she had not cried until she was on the train to Memphis 3 weeks later, and then she cried until she was empty, and then she was done. He listened to all of this without interruption, which was his gift. He was a man who listened with his whole attention, not waiting for his turn to speak but actually receiving what was said. I want to ask you something, he said when she was finished, and she heard in his voice the particular tone that meant he had been holding the question carefully, making sure of it before he let it out. Ask, she said. Do you trust me? He said it plainly, looking at the road ahead. I know that's a large question, and I know you have reasons to be careful with it. I am not asking you to trust me blindly or to pretend you are more certain than you are. I am asking whether you trust me sufficiently at this point, given what you know. She thought about the rain on the train platform. She thought about the writing desk. She thought about Jane Eyre on the bottom shelf and the way he listened and the way he had looked at her on horseback against the enormous Kansas sky. Yes, she said, I trust you sufficiently. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something important had been confirmed. They rode on. In Wichita, they stayed at different hotels, as propriety demanded, and met each morning at Ezra Pullman's office, which was a cramped but organized space above a surveyor's supply shop near the courthouse. Pullman was a sharp-eyed, energetic man of about 45 with ink permanently on 3 fingers, and the manner of someone who found land fraud personally offensive as an aesthetic matter as well as a legal one. Theodore Marsh, he said, when Orville presented the fraudulent document. He picked it up and held it at arm's length. I know that name. He lost his license in 1880 over a filing discrepancy in Harvey County. He set it down. I will want to subpoena the original survey documents from the county records office. If this is a forgery of Marsh's signature on a document backdated after he lost his license, it won't hold. What if it isn't a forgery? Etta asked. What if Marsh actually made the survey but the filing date was manipulated? Pullman looked at her with the revised attention he had been offering her since the first morning, when she asked him 3 specific questions that demonstrated she had read the relevant sections of the Kansas Land Act. Then we established that the survey was conducted after Lockhart's fence was already in place, which means the claim of priority is false regardless of the survey's technical legitimacy. Can you establish that? She asked. With neighbors' testimony and your original fencing records, almost certainly, Pullman said and looked at Orville. Do you have records? Every purchase, every post, every stretch of wire, Orville said. She suggested I bring them. Pullman looked from Orville to Etta and back again and made no comment, but something in his expression moved in the direction of appreciation. The Wichita proceedings took 9 days, during which Etta saw parts of Orville Lockhart that letters could not have shown her. His patience under the grinding procedural tedium of legal process, his absolute refusal to exaggerate or embroider any testimony even when doing so might have strengthened his case, the way he treated every person in that courthouse with the same basic courtesy, regardless of their position. She saw him angry once, truly angry, when it emerged that Crane had used the same fraudulent claim to drive a smaller homesteader off 40 acres near Reno County, and the man had taken the loss because he didn't have the resources to fight it, and Orville's voice went very quiet and very flat, and Pullman put a hand on his arm and said carefully, "We will get what we came for, Mr. Lockhart. The larger injustice is a separate matter." "It shouldn't be," Orville said. "No," Pullman agreed. "It shouldn't." The case was resolved in Orville's favor on the 9th day, the fraudulent filing invalidated on grounds of forged filing date and invalid surveyor credentials. Albert Crane faced additional charges from 2 other ranchers whose cases Pullman agreed to take on the strength of the precedent Orville's case had established. The 80 acres of eastern fence line were confirmed as Lockhart property. They stood outside the courthouse in the April Wichita sunshine, and Orville looked at the sky for a long moment. Then he looked at Etta. "Thank you," he said, and the way he said it was not the way a man thanks an associate or even a friend. It was the way a person speaks when they mean something that goes past the words. "I didn't want to be someone who sat upstairs," she said. "I know." He looked at her in the full spring light and she looked back at him, and between them was everything that had been building since the train platform and the letters and the firelit front room and the great open grassland on horseback, and it was enormous. He reached out and took her hand. Just took it, clasped it in his large warm hand, right there on the public street in Wichita in the April sunshine. She let him hold it. She held it back. "I think," he said carefully and deliberately, "that I would like to ask you something when we get home." "I think," she said just as carefully, "that I would like to say yes." They looked at each other for one more moment and then she laughed. It was the first time he had heard her actually laugh, fully and without restraint, and it was the best sound he had heard in a very long time, warm and real and undefended. "Come on then," she said, and did not let go of his hand until they reached the street corner. They were married in Caldwell on the last Saturday of May, 1882, in the small white Methodist church at the end of Main Street, with Reverend Aldies presiding and Margaret and Thomas Chen as witnesses and Consuela in the front pew in her best dark dress looking simultaneously unmoved and deeply satisfied. The service was simple, as both of them had wanted, and the vows they exchanged were the standard ones because both of them had thought about the words and agreed that the standard words, said with genuine intention, were as good as anything they might compose themselves. Orville said his vows in his clear, quiet voice without looking away from her face, and she heard in each word the same quality she had first noticed in his advertisement. No decoration, no excess, only what was true, offered fully. When the Reverend pronounced them married, Orville took her face in both his hands, the way someone handles something precious and durable both, and kissed her in front of the whole congregation with a gentleness that was not timidity but something far more considered. And Etta Abbott, who was now Etta Lockhart, kissed him back with the full force of 11 months of letters and 52 days of presents, and every private shift in her chest that she had been carefully cataloging and not yet naming. Margaret Chen cried. Thomas Chen looked at the ceiling. Consuela produced a handkerchief that she did not use but had apparently brought as a measure of contingency. The wedding supper was held at the Lockhart Ranch, which Consuela had spent 3 days preparing for, and which involved more food than 6 people could reasonably consume, and 2 of Orville's neighboring ranchers who had been invited because they were decent men, and because Etta had liked them when she met them and Orville trusted her judgment. There was laughter at the table, in a way the ranch house had not had in a long time, the uncontrolled kind that comes from being among people you genuinely like. And Orville sat at the head of his table and looked at his wife laughing at something Margaret had said, and he felt something in his chest settle into a rightness that he had been working toward for 12 years of building and 4 years of grief and 11 months of letters without knowing exactly what it was he was building toward. He knew now. Summer came to the Kansas prairie in long, gold-burning waves, and Etta Lockhart settled into the Lockhart Ranch the way she settled into everything, with attention and method and the particular pleasure she took in understanding things deeply. She learned the cattle work, or at least the parts of it that she could participate in and that Orville was willing to teach her, which turned out to be more than she had expected because Orville's approach to teaching was to simply explain things as they were doing them, without condescension, treating her competence as a given, and adjusting only for lack of experience rather than lack of capability. She learned to ride Rosie in the purposeful way of someone who intended the skill, not as leisure. She kept a detailed household ledger that, within 2 months, had identified 2 areas where they were spending inefficiently. She continued her correspondence with potential mail-order brides for other ranchers in the area, a project she had inherited from a small column in the Caldwell commercial, and had transformed into something considerably more systematic, matching women and men with a care for compatibility that went well beyond the usual cursory introductions. "You are running a matchmaking operation," Orville told her one evening, with a note in his voice that she had learned was his version of amused. "I am facilitating correspondence between interested parties," she said, without looking up from her writing. "You vetted the last 3 men before you gave out their addresses," he said. "I did. How?" "I asked Margaret, who asked Thomas, who asked at the stockyard." She set down her pen. "If a man cannot be known for decency in his own community, he should not be inviting a woman from a distance to trust him." He was quiet for a moment. "You're thinking about your own situation." "I'm thinking about women who don't have 11 months of careful letters to go on," she said. "Some of these advertisements are less than honest, and some of these men are less than what they claim, and the women have no way to know that from 500 miles away." He sat down across from her. "What would you like to do about it?" She looked at him. This was one of the things she loved about him. He never told her what she should want. He asked what she wanted to do. "I want to build something more organized," she said. "A proper registry with references. Women who can write to women who have already made the journey and can give an honest account. Men who have been vetted through their neighbors and employers. Not perfect, nothing is perfect, but better than random chance." "That would be considerable work," he said. "I know. I'll help you write the initial letters," he offered. "I know enough of the ranchers in this county to give you a place to start on the men's side." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, this man who had stood in the rain with a sign that had her name on it, and she thought, "I did not expect to be this lucky. I was not naive enough to think I would be this lucky, but here it is anyway." "Orville," she said. "Yes." "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said everything important, plainly, having thought about it carefully with no drama and no hedging, because it was true and she had decided it was time to say it. He looked at her and she saw something move through him that was large and quiet and very deep, the way the prairie moved in wind, the whole surface of it in motion at once. "I know," he said, and then more quietly, "I have been in love with you since your second letter." She stared at him. "The second letter. The one where you said integrity is not the absence of lying but the commitment to being truthful when it costs something," he said. "Yes, that letter. That was in November," she said. "You waited until March to even imply a preference." "I didn't want to pressure you," he said. "I knew you had been hurt. I thought if I moved carefully you would come to it in your own time." She looked at him for a long moment and then she shook her head slowly, but she was also smiling, the full warm smile that was still rare enough to be significant. "Orville Lockhart, you are the most patient man in the state of Kansas." "Probably," he agreed. She got up from the table and came around to his side and stood before him. And he stood, because that was how he was. And she put her hands on either side of his face in the same way he had taken her face in his hands at the altar. And she kissed him with everything she had, all the months and the letters and the trust that had been so carefully rebuilt, all of it given freely and without reservation. Outside the limestone house, the Kansas night stretched in all directions under a sky full of stars that were enormous and close in the flat darkness, and the prairie breathed around them, and Consuela, who was tactfully in the kitchen, hummed a song to herself and did not come out. The summer passed in the golden way of summers that are actively good, made of work and weather and long evenings, and the slow deepening of a love that had already been built on a substantial foundation. They disagreed sometimes, because they were both particular and opinionated about practical things. The best route for the cattle during the dry season, the most efficient way to organize the barn, whether the east fence needed to be reinforced before winter. These disagreements were always direct and sometimes heated and always resolved, because neither of them was interested in being right more than in getting to the best answer. They agreed about the things that mattered: honesty, work, the land, the importance of being useful, the value of people who said what they meant. They read to each other in the evenings. She started with Jane Austen, and he started with the natural history volumes, and they ended up reading to each other somewhat randomly across genres, so that a given evening might include a chapter of persuasion followed by a section on prairie grass root systems, both equally interesting to both of them, which was one of the things Etta found most remarkable about him. He was curious in the same direction she was, which was all directions at once. In August she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning at the kitchen table over coffee because she was not someone who built up to things dramatically. She said, "I believe I am expecting a child based on the evidence of the last 6 weeks and what the doctor confirmed yesterday." He had been looking at the cattle ledger. He set it down. He looked at her. His expression went through several things in quick succession that she watched with the attention she had learned to give his face. Surprise, which was real because she had kept the doctor's visit to herself while she processed the information. Then something that moved very fast from surprise to a kind of quiet, enormous joy. And then, briefly, something she had not expected. Vulnerability. Not fear exactly. The look of someone who has been handed something precious and is suddenly aware of how precious it is. "Etta," he said, "just her name." "I know," she said, and she did. She understood what was in his face because she had thought about it for the 6 weeks she had been waiting to tell him. Clara had died. Things precious could be lost. He knew that viscerally, in the way that only direct experience could teach. And she had known, even before the doctor confirmed it, that telling him would bring that knowledge to the surface alongside the joy. She reached across the table and took his hand. "I am healthy and the doctor is confident and I am not afraid," she told him. "I am not Clara, and this is not that situation, and I need you to know that I understand why you are feeling what you are feeling, but I need you to also know that I intend to be fine." He looked at her hand over his, then he looked at her face, then he turned his hand over and held hers properly, firmly, with intention. "I know you're not afraid," he said. "I know you are capable of everything you take on. I know all of that." His voice was very low. "I just want you to let me be careful with you." "You can be careful with me," she said. "I'll allow it." "Generous," he said. "I thought so," she agreed. He raised her hand and pressed it briefly to his face, not kissing it, just holding it there, and she felt his breath against her fingers and thought, "We are going to be good at this. We are going to be good at all of it." Consuela, when she was told, nodded as though she had known for 2 weeks, which she probably had, and immediately began reorganizing the kitchen on principles that would later prove entirely prescient, and which involved very little discussion because Consuela's organizational systems needed no discussion, only implementation. Margaret Chen was told next and cried happy tears and then immediately began making plans for a gathering of the neighboring women to sew, which was how practical affection expressed itself on the Kansas frontier, and which Etta submitted to with more genuine warmth than she would have predicted, because the gathering of women around a task was something she had been missing without quite knowing it. And sitting in her own front room with 5 other women doing useful work, while talking about real things, turned out to be one of the great pleasures of her new life. The fall came fast and cold, which was typical of Kansas, and Orville prepared the ranch for winter with the systematic thoroughness that she now recognized as the physical expression of his love. The same quality that had stood in the rain holding her name was in the way he banked the fence lines and checked every inch of the barn roof and laid in the winter provisions with care that considered not just efficiency but comfort. He brought her a second lamp for the writing desk so she could work in the evenings without straining her eyes. He did not announce this or present it with ceremony. He simply set it on the desk one evening and went back to what he was doing. She noticed it and said nothing, and he said nothing, and between them this exchange of noticing and receiving was entirely complete. The baby arrived in late March of 1883, precisely as winter was releasing its grip on the Kansas plains, and the first green was beginning to show in the prairie grass. It was a boy, born at dawn after a hard night, delivered with the quiet competence of Dr. Harmon from Caldwell, who had been sent for and arrived in time, and who afterward said to Orville in the hallway, outside the bedroom, that Mrs. Lockhart had handled herself with remarkable composure throughout, which was not remotely surprising to Orville, but which he appreciated being told. They named him James Orville Lockhart, after Orville's father, who had died before the ranch was built, and whom Orville had spoken of in letters as the person who first taught him that a man's word was his most durable asset. The morning after James was born, Orville sat in the rocking chair by the bedroom window with his son in his arms, and the sun came through the east window over the prairie that was just beginning to green, and Etta watched him from the bed, this steady, careful man holding his son in the morning light, and she thought, this is what the sign in the rain was for. This is what the letters were for. This is what all of it was pointing toward this particular morning, this particular light, this man and this child and this life that is real and whole and ours. She said, "He looks like you." Orville looked up from the baby's face. "You think so?" Around the forehead, very serious. "He's a few hours old." "He's already serious," she said. "He came into the world with an agenda." Orville looked back at the baby, and the smile that came across his face was the unguarded kind, the kind she only saw in private moments, full and real, and with nothing held back, and she loved him so much in that moment that it filled the entire room like light. Consuela appeared in the doorway with breakfast and declined to comment on either the smile or the tears that had appeared on Etta's face, because Consuela understood what moments required silence and what moments required cornbread, and this one required both. Life on the Lockhart Ranch in the years that followed was not uncomplicated. The cattle business was subject to the vagaries of weather and markets, and the relentless politics of the expanding railroad lines that were changing the economics of the beef trade in ways that required constant adaptation. There were 2 hard years in the mid-'80s when a drought year followed by the brutal winter of 1886 killed a significant portion of the herd and made the following spring a question of rebuilding from a reduced position. But they had built wisely and without overextension, which was Etta's contribution as much as Orville's. her sharp analytical eye having caught two potential investments in the early years that would have stretched their resources dangerously thin. They sold cattle when the market was right and held when it was not. They maintained their water rights with the vigilance that Etta had identified in her very first week as the critical issue. And they came through the hard years leaner but intact, which was more than many of their neighbors could say. The correspondence registry that Etta had begun in her first summer had by 1884 become a genuine institution, at least in Sumner County and the surrounding area, operating through a network of women correspondents in 6 states who shared information about both potential brides and potential grooms with the honest thoroughness that Etta had designed it to require. It was not profitable. It was not intended to be. But it had resulted in 14 marriages in 3 years, all of which were to her knowledge functioning, and 3 of which she would later hear described as outright love matches of the kind that made other people jealous, which she considered a reasonable success rate given the difficulties involved. Margaret Chen helped her run it and was her closest friend for the rest of their lives in Kansas, a friendship built on the same foundation as her marriage: honesty and genuine mutual respect, and the pleasure of being known by someone who actually looked. James Lockhart grew from a serious infant into a serious, bright, deeply curious child, who was very clearly his mother's son in intellect and his father's son in character. He asked a great many precise questions, and then acted on the answers with quiet, methodical conviction. By the time he was 5, he was following Orville around the ranch the way smaller creatures follow the larger creature they have decided to pattern themselves on, and Orville taught him the way he taught everything, which was by simply doing it and explaining as he went. And the two of them talking about the land and the cattle and the weather and the water in the long morning rides across the ranch were something Etta would watch from the porch and feel as a warmth so complete she had no word for it. Their second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1886, who they named Clara. Orville had suggested the name quietly, one evening, saying only that he thought it would be right, and Etta had considered it carefully and agreed because she understood the kind of honoring he meant, not clinging to something gone but acknowledging that it had been real and mattered, which was consistent with everything she knew about him. Clara Lockhart grew up different from her brother in almost every way that was interesting: loud where he was quiet, social where he was solitary, inclined toward horses and outdoor physical activity, with a confidence and fearlessness that kept Orville in a permanent state of calm vigilance, because Clara's fearlessness was entirely real and not always correlated with sound judgment, which was a combination that required consistent parental attention. Etta handled Clara with the same directness she handled everything, which Clara found alternately exasperating and deeply reassuring, as children do when they encounter limits that are maintained consistently. Orville handled Clara the way he handled everything that surprised him, by paying full attention to what it actually was rather than what he expected it to be, which meant that Clara Lockhart grew up with a father who genuinely saw her as she was, stubborn and brave and brilliant and messy, and who loved all of it without reservation. The third child, born in 1889, was another boy. They named him William, and he turned out to be the most purely cheerful person in the family, a quality that mystified Etta in the best possible way, and which Orville said, privately, he thought might have come from some deep familial source they had not yet located. "He's just happy," Orville said one evening watching William, who was 2, attempting to teach a barn cat to perform tricks. "He is genuinely just happy," Etta agreed, watching with the same puzzled appreciation. "I don't quite know where he got it." "Could be a gift," Orville said. "For whom?" "For all of us," he said. "Happy people remind you that happiness is possible." She looked at him. "When did you get philosophical?" "I've always been philosophical," he said. "I just usually keep it to myself." "Orville," she said, "after 7 years of marriage you should know better than to keep things from me." "I know," he said. "Fortunately, you always find out anyway." She leaned against him on the porch railing in the evening summer warmth, and he put his arm around her, and William continued his confident negotiations with the cat, and the prairie stretched out before them in the long gold light, and it was entirely, completely right. The Lockhart Ranch in the late 1880s had grown to just over 800 acres under careful management, the eastern fence line now firmly and legally secured, the water rights protected through an agreement Etta had personally negotiated with two neighboring ranchers that established shared access protocols and prevented the monopolization she had worried about years earlier. The agreement had required 3 meetings and considerable patience, and when it was finalized, all 3 parties shook hands and Etta came home and told Orville that she thought the hardest part of any negotiation was getting people to believe that fair arrangements were more durable than advantageous ones. "Did you convince them?" he asked. "Temporarily," she said. "I'll need to reinforce it periodically." He smiled. "I know better than to tell you how to manage that," he said. "Smart man," she said. The registry project had by 1888 grown into something she had not entirely anticipated. It was being written about in the Kansas newspapers as an example of organized support for frontier women, and a woman in Denver had written to ask if the model could be replicated in Colorado. Etta wrote back a detailed letter explaining the structure, which was more or less the same systematic, verification-based approach she had applied to everything in her life, and the Denver correspondent had used it and written back 6 months later to say it was working. The recognition was not something Etta sought and was not something she particularly valued, except insofar as it meant the work was actually effective. What she valued was the letters she received from women who had made the journey and found it good. The woman from Indiana who wrote to say that her husband had turned out to be exactly who his references described, honest and hardworking and kind, and that she had been afraid and now she was not, and that she wished someone had built such a system years earlier. Etta kept every one of those letters in a box under the writing desk that Orville had put in her room on the first day, which she still used because it fit exactly right. One evening in the fall of 1889, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and the autumn wind was beginning to test the windows the way it did in Kansas, Etta sat at the writing desk finishing a letter and Orville sat across the room with a book, and the lamp between them made the room warm and close and intimate in the way that rooms become when they have been lived in well for a long time. He looked up from his book. "What are you thinking?" he asked. It was the question he had always asked when she was quiet for a long time, and he asked it with the same genuine curiosity as always, never assuming he knew. "I was thinking about the train station," she said. He waited. "I was thinking about how I got off the train and the platform was empty and I almost thought for a moment that I had arrived in the wrong place or at the wrong time." She paused. "And then I saw the sign." He was very still. "You wrote my name on a piece of wood," she said, "and you stood in the rain with it for 2 hours. And I knew, right then, before you had said a word to me, that you were exactly who you had written yourself to be." She set down her pen. "And I want you to know that I think about that every time I am uncertain about anything, because that certainty has never once failed." He looked at her across the lamplight, this woman who had stepped off a late train into the Kansas rain and walked toward him across a wet platform and put out her hand and changed everything. "I would do it again," he said. "Any amount of rain." "I know," she said. "That's exactly what I mean." She crossed the room and sat beside him, and he put the book down and put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side the way she had been leaning into him for 7 years. And outside the Kansas wind moved across the prairie in the dark, and in the rooms upstairs 3 children slept with the complete confidence of children who have never had reason to doubt that the world was solid around them. Orville pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you," he said, into her hair. He said it the way he said everything real, plainly, without decoration, having thought about it. "I love you," she said, into his shoulder. "I have loved you since your 4th letter, for the record. You were ahead of me. "The second letter," he reminded her. "You didn't tell me. You didn't tell me either." "We were both being careful," she said. "We were," he agreed. "It worked out," she said. "It did," he said. There was a long, easy silence, the kind that is only possible between two people who have no remaining need to fill it. "I have something to tell you," she said finally. He waited. "I believe there will be a fourth child," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then she felt the breath go through him in a long exhale that was, she knew, the releasing of the particular tightness that every pregnancy still brought him. And then what remained was the quiet joy. "When?" he asked. "June, perhaps," she said. "Possibly July. I'll speak to Dr. Harmon in the morning." "I already have," she said. "Of course you have," he said, and the warmth in his voice was enormous. They sat together in the lamplight until the fire burned low, and then they went upstairs in the quiet house, and the prairie outside breathed in the darkness, and the limestone walls of the house that did not leak held the warmth in as they had always done, solid and permanent and built to last. The fourth child was a boy, born in late June of 1890, in the full heat of a Kansas summer, and they named him Arthur, which had been Etta's father's name, the man who had first taught her that a mind was something to be used, and that no one had the right to tell her otherwise. Arthur Lockhart, as he grew, turned out to have his mother's precision and his father's patience, which made him, Etta observed when he was about 4, potentially the most formidable person any of them had ever produced. "He will need guidance," she told Orville. "He has it," Orville said. She looked at her husband and thought of all the ways in which that was simply and completely true, and was grateful for it in a way she had no adequate words for, though she tried from time to time. The years settled into the rhythm that a good life finds when it has been well built, not without difficulty, because nothing real was ever without difficulty, but with the kind of deep, established stability that comes from two people who have decided to be honest with each other about everything, and have kept that commitment through weather and loss and uncertainty and growth, and who have found in that commitment a freedom that people who have not experienced it sometimes mistake for ordinariness. It was not ordinary. It was the result of an advertisement in a Tennessee newspaper, and 11 months of careful letters and a train platform in the rain, and a sign in plain black letters, held up by a man who had decided that waiting was the most accurate way he could think of to say, "I mean what I wrote, and I think you are worth meaning it for." She had stepped off the train and she had seen her name in his hands, and she had understood. Orville Lockhart had built a cattle ranch out of 40 acres of raw Kansas grassland, and he had built a marriage out of honesty and patience, and the specific, steady courage of someone who knows what he values and does not pretend otherwise. And he had built a family out of 4 mornings in different Junes and Marches, when new lives arrived into the limestone house on the prairie, and the world expanded again into something larger than it had been. And Etta Abbott, who had sat in a Memphis boarding house with a newspaper open on the counter and read an advertisement that said only what was true, had come to Kansas and found the truth waiting for her in the rain, and had chosen it with the whole clear force of herself. The prairie stretched around the Lockhart ranch in every direction under the enormous Kansas sky, and the wind moved through the grass the way it always had and always would, and the limestone house held the warmth and the light and the voices of 4 children and 2 people who had found their way to each other through letters and rain, and the particular faith of those who believe that honesty, practiced steadily, will eventually find what it is looking for. And it had. And they were home.